All right, welcome back. It's episode 26. It's all in the purity. I'm Reed Evans, and we're going to talk today a real quick one, hopefully, about writing pure functions. So all the stuff that I talked about, really, you can't do anything with unless the functions that you're composing and mapping and binding and chaining and applying over are pure functions because it just doesn't work otherwise. You'll hear a lot of people mention things like it makes the code easy to reason about. So hopefully we can show an example here. So I end up doing a lot of parsing. I don't know about you all. I end up doing a lot of parsing from, as far as system integrations and things like that. So I was writing some parsing today. It was not this, but you can kind of imagine. We've got a parse function that, given a string, we return a string. And keep in mind that this is what the function definition says. Now JavaScript's dynamically typed, weakly typed, there's all sorts of different ways of describing what the JavaScript type system is. But regardless of that, this is what, in my mind, I was going to write. And so it ends up working okay. So I'm using this switch statement. We don't have pattern matching yet, although there is a spec for that came out, or that I saw a few weeks ago, which would be great. Would make match and actually an expression rather than it being a statement where we have to return everywhere. But anyway, I digress. So we're switching over S. And so if it's tier 1, then we'll return critical. In case if it's tier 2, we return high. Well, let's say those are the only two that we have. Have I satisfied this method signature, or this function signature? I mean, I have if I provide some sort of default, but I think a lot of people here might do something like, maybe return quote quote, or even potentially worse, throw. But if you're doing that, you're saying that I'm going to return a string, and is quote quote a valid string? In my mind, basically what you're doing there is you're encoding the specific semantics of a special case into a string. Why don't we use a type to end up handling that? So just so we see what would actually happen here, is if we call parse on tier, then in this case we'd get quote quote. If we pass tier 1, we would get critical, obviously. But instead, why don't we do something really neat? Let's encode into our function the fact that given a string, we can either return you some sort of an error or a string. And this looks very, very similar. What you see here is that for tier 1, we're going to wrap it up in either of critical, tier 2 either of high, and then if it's not one of those, if those are the only two string values that we really want to accept and handle, that we can provide a string representation for, then our default case we can return an either left, and whatever you want to pass here. I kind of like this from a debugging standpoint, letting us know which method was called. So in this case we got parse either, and then we got the args s. That goes off the screen. We'll just say that it's parse, and then we pass and then we let it know the argument. And so this is pretty neat. This is very, very pure. We're not relying on an empty string or some other cargo cult knowledge that the result from this, if it's quote quote, you need to do something with. No. This thing's going to return an either. To deal with the string that might be there, you have to deal with the error case and the case where it's a string. I like that much better. That's code that I would want to call. That's a library I would want to use. So if we parse either and we pass tier 1, we get critical as we would expect, but it's in critical wrapped up in an either right. And of course, if we pass foo, then we get an either left. We see that foo was passed. We know which method or function we were calling that on. In this case was parse, so it came from here. So for me, in this case, we can satisfy. For all string values you give me, I can return you either an error or a string. That makes a lot of sense. If you're working with some other languages that would actually, like a Haskell or an Idris, where you can actually constrain your domain, that's great. I would question why you're listening to me, because you should probably be creating these videos because I want to watch them. But for all languages that we cannot constrain our domain as well, and we're forced to be dealing with things like string here, we can in fact increase our codomain and still keep our functions pure. So there you have it, episode number 26. It's all about the purity. If you can't return a value of the type that you're saying you can for every element that can possibly be in your domain, you need to be thinking about returning an either or a maybe. Thanks again. I've been Reed Evans. Let me know what you think.